Okay, the ball's in your court. It's open Q&A.
If Ishmael was judged where he was, and he was found, he was good at that point in time, why was his descendants, I mean, they were given all this oil in Arabia? I mean, obviously they've been our enemies for a long time. I mean, the Ishmael,
Yeah.
you know, so he was judged good then, but subsequently, the Arabs have been antagonistic towards us.
Yeah, but I'm not quite sure what the question is. Let's
question
take Isaac.
Yeah.
Isaac, the second patriarch,
Yeah.
was a good person, great person, one of the founders of the world.
Yeah.
One of his sons was Esau.
Yeah.
Esau
Yeah.
gave rise to millennia of opposition.
Yes.
What has the goodness of the father got to do with what his children or descendants become? Ishmael died at Tzaddik. Ishmael did tshuva and died at Tzaddik. Not only was he good at the time when he was judged there, although he went through an interim period that was not good, he did tshuva and he died at Tzaddik. So in the end, he was a good person altogether.
All right.
Just like Terach did tshuva, Ishmael did tshuva. The fact that his descendants became distorted in a certain way, people have free will, and out of great people, terrible people can come, and vice versa. Out of terrible people, great people can come. So for us, there's no guarantee that because your parents were one way, you're going to be one way or the other way. There's no guarantee. That for us is not a problem. Well, just to pass the time until you think of a question. This is supposed to be Q&A. I got a letter from someone recently questioning the recent war, considering the deaths of innocent civilians. Of course, it's not obvious that there were any, but okay, non-combatants, people who weren't holding guns at the time. And he said, there is a law, a Jewish law, that if someone is chasing you to kill you, and you can only save yourself by killing him, kill him! There's absolutely no reason to let yourself be killed. He's trying to commit murder, and you have every right to save yourself by killing him. However, if he's chasing you to kill you, and the only way you can stop him, is by killing him and some other innocent person, then you can't do that. You're not allowed to kill an innocent person to save yourself from a murderer who's trying to kill you. The classical case in the Gemara is where you have a trio of people. A tells B to kill C, and A says to B, either you kill C or I'm going to kill you. And we assume that A means it, and we know that he means it, and he has the ability to carry it out. Can B kill C to save his own life? And the answer is no, he cannot do that. So, this person asked, why is it permissible for the IDF to bomb Gaza, trying to kill terrorists of Hamas, if when they bomb Gaza, they're also going to kill innocent people? Again, assuming that they're really innocent people there, which is, I think, a non-trivial assumption, not to be taken for granted. But okay, talking about the principle of the thing. So I said to him, I think you're right. The law of Rodef, the law of escaping a pursuer, would not allow that. But we're dealing with war. War is a different concept. The normal rules of preserving life, the normal rules of responding to pursuers don't apply in wartime. Wartime has its own set of rules. For example, in the same spirit, you can't save yourself by sending somebody else to die in your place. That's true under all normal conditions. It's true for an isolated incident. It's not true in wartime. The Torah mandates raising an army. It has rules as to who has to participate in the army, and they have to participate. Not given a choice. No conscientious objectors. And that means, as an army, they're going out and putting themselves in danger so as to protect the rest of the population. That's not the normal rule of non-war circumstances, but under war circumstances, that is a normal rule. There was a very poignant incident that took place in the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War. The Syrians overran the Golan Heights. They overran the whole of the Golan Heights. The IDF was chased off the Golan Heights entirely. It took months to battle it back. At one point, they overran a bunker, and there was a secret portion to the bunker where some IDF soldiers were hiding, while the Syrians were overrunning the bunker. And one of the IDF soldiers was wounded, and he was crying out in pain. And the commander of the group said to another soldier, "Strangle him. Strangle him. Because if he cries out in pain, he's going to give away our location, and they'll come and kill all of us." And the soldier obeyed the orders and strangled him, and did indeed silence him, but the wounded soldier didn't die. He didn't die. And after the war, the commander and the wounded soldier appeared on television together. And when questioned, when the commander was questioned, we don't sacrifice one to save more. He said, that's true under normal circumstances, but in wartime it's not true. That's not the way a war is fought. For example, you have two armies facing one another, and one army wants to make a surprise attack and wants to draw off fire from the other army by sending out a patrol that should fire on the other army and draw the enemy army's fire in that direction while they attack from here. Is that permissible? They'll be killed. The patrol that goes out to draw the fire is going to be killed. Are you allowed to send out a patrol and sacrifice their lives so as to make the attack successful? The answer is yes, you are. The laws of war are not the laws of normal danger of life. One of my friends said to me, an example of this you can find in the war against Amalek. Saul goes out to wage war against Amalek. There's a small population of descendants of Yisro living among the Amalekites, the Canaanites, and Saul sends them a message. Your ancestor, Yisro, did kindness with us when we left Egypt, and we regard you as our friends, and we have, of course, no vendetta against you. Leave the Amalekites, move out of the way, because we're going to attack them. And if you don't move out of the way, then you may very well be destroyed by our attack. Says Mesudus David, because in wartime, when battles are going on, it's very difficult to be careful and distinguish who it is you're attacking, person by person. So they were given advance notice to get out of the way so they won't be hurt. But Saul's statement indicates, if you don't get out of the way, we are carrying out the attack. This is a war, and if you're in the way, you're very likely to get hurt. We're not going to cancel the attack on the grounds that you're innocent people who happen to be in the same vicinity. So we're telling you to get out of the way. I think this is very similar to scattering leaflets from the sky and the knock on the roof policy. You're aware of the knock on the roof policy? This is amazing. Before they blew up a building, the IDF drops a low-grade mortar on the roof, which goes bang, and the building shakes a little bit. And that's the notice that in 5 minutes it's going to be destroyed so that everybody can get out. Because they were destroying buildings. Because those buildings had civilians in them, people who weren't presumably terrorists, so they had to knock on the roof. No army in the world does that. No army in the world does that. One British officer, non-Jew, wrote, in an average war, the ratio of casualties of non-combatants to combatants is 4-to-1. 4 times as many non-combatants get killed as combatants. In this war in Gaza, it's about roughly 50-50, which means it's a very, very low non-combatant ratio. At any rate, I I wrote back to him. It's interesting because he represents the political left, far, far left. And he accepted it. He understood there's a difference between normal danger to life and normal attack of a criminal on the one hand, and laws of war. They have different rules, and you can't make an analogy from one to the other. So, using my friend's example, at least we achieved some kind of understanding. Anyway, okay, that was an interlude. Let's give you an opportunity to think of questions. This is supposedly open Q&A. Yeah.
This might be a bit of an annoying question to ask. How can you prove God?
You can't, and I would suggest that you don't get stuck trying or accepting that responsibility. I don't think you can prove anything. Anything. You can't prove who your parents are. You can't prove propositions of mathematics or logic. You can't prove anything. My recommendation is, on philosophical grounds, don't get stuck in that corner. It's a false corner to be in. Rather, ask, how can we show there's adequate reason? Well, yeah, but that's a gigantic difference. Gigantic difference. To show there's adequate reason to believe in God. Here's where the difference shows. If I present what I call, and the other person expects, to be a proof, I can be defeated by his imagination. All he has to do is imagine an alternative. Maybe it was extraterrestrials. Bang! It's not a proof. Proof means absolute certainty, infallibility, 100% probability. If he can imagine another alternative, it's not a proof. I'm not interested in doing battle with somebody's imagination. I credit people with very fertile imaginations. I invite them to write novels and make a mint. I present positive evidence for my view. That positive evidence gives my view a certain probability. The only way to respond to evidence and probability is to provide counter evidence, real evidence from the real world, not just imagination, not thinking up possible alternatives, but do the research and find counter evidence in the real world. Then I have to respond. If I present a certain amount of evidence, somebody presents counter evidence, then I have to either try to delegitimize his evidence, or I have to show my evidence is superior to his evidence. Something has to be done when the person is presenting positive counter evidence. Don't ever accept the responsibility to provide a proof. Don't invite people to respond only with their imaginations. Present concrete evidence and show that that gives your view support, and then invite them to provide counter evidence against your view, which provides support for some alternative to your view, and argue it out on the basis of the actual support. Don't ever think in terms of proof.
You find in that sense then what evidence we have that there is.
Well, that's summarized. I can summarize that in about 10 hours. So if you're ready to stay here till tomorrow morning, I could do that. And it's all on my website, and it's on Torah Anytime, which has later stuff of mine, and it's written up in a primitive form on my website, and it's not something I can do in a question and answer session. And I do it several times a year as a long series of lectures. So it's something which you'll undoubtedly have a chance to hear. But I can't do that.
So let's say, obviously there's God, right? My follow-up question is, how do you know that it was the Torah that he wrote, and how do you know that was like the blueprint of the world and what, ideally Jews should follow, or anyone who wants to be a holy neshama should follow? I mean, how do we know, first of all, that he wrote the Torah, and that needs to be the instruction for every Jew on how they live their life?
Well, okay, but again, how do you know is not now going to be a proof.
Okay.
It's going to be evidence. So when the objection comes in this vocabulary. But how do you know it isn't? That's illegitimate. I don't have to prove it isn't some other possibility. The objection comes, maybe it's really, that's illegitimate. Maybe it's illegitimate. I only have to pay attention to positive counter evidence. Okay, so I think we have direct evidence for revelation at Sinai. Direct, empirical evidence for the revelation at Sinai. Once you have the revelation at Sinai, you know that God spoke to the whole people. You know that he told them what we call the 10 pronouncements, falsely called the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments was at Sinai. You know that everybody heard that. And we have a record of that. And the record is in a book, and that book itself says that it was written by Moses. And that book has remained in our possession, virtually unchanged. Virtually, there are over 300,000 letters, and there's some dispute about 15. I would say that 15 out of 300,000 is virtually unchanged. And the 15 make no difference in meaning whatsoever. There's alternate spellings of the same word. So I say we have evidence of continuity of the text, we have evidence of the original event, and therefore, since the event and the text tell us that this is the Torah that God wants Jews to live by, the conclusions that you want fall out right away.
Okay, so okay, so what evidence is there that, the Torah was actually, written? How do you know it's not just some person's made up?
See, now I qualify as a prophet. How do you know it's not?
How can you...
You're asking me to eliminate imagined other possibilities. That's not my job. Your imagination is fertile. You can do that as much as you like. I will tell you, I can do this fairly briefly. I will tell you the evidence that we have that the revelation at Sinai is a real event. I'm encapsulating a lot of argumentation, but there's one, I can put the basic idea very briefly. We have a tradition that lasted unanimous in the Jewish people for thousands of years. That tradition says that our ancestors at a particular time had an experience. By our ancestors at a particular time, I mean all of our ancestors at that time. Every man, woman, and child had a particular experience. And it's the kind of experience that we would expect would leave a mark on the nation. It's not the kind of experience you would expect people to forget. Okay? We have a tradition. Until 300 years ago, every Jew in the history of the world believed that there was a revelation at Sinai. We have lots of heresies in the Tanakh. We have lots of heresies in the Midrash and the Talmud. Never did anyone question the revelation at Sinai. Not to mention, that the Christian and the Muslim accepted also. But there was never any question of that. So we have a thousands of years old tradition. That tradition describes the experience at Sinai where everybody heard God speak. Everybody. And hearing God speak is not the sort of thing you expect to forget over evening soccer scores. It's something which is going to be part of the life of the nation. Now, I ask, is there any known human tradition anywhere? Aztecs, Chinese, Babylonians, Native Americans, Eskimos, Assyria, Egypt, Rome, Greece. Is there any tradition fitting that description anywhere in the whole history of mankind that is known to be false? That is to say, the entire nation at some time accepts it. The tradition describes at some prior time an experience that every man, woman, and child in the nation had. And the experience is something which, in the normal course of things, you would expect would be remembered. Is there any such tradition in all of mankind that is known to be false? Well, I've been researching this for about 10 years, and I've had dozens of counterexamples sent to me by people all over the world. And when I examined each one, not a single one turned out to fit the conditions that I described. As far as I'm aware, as far as I've been able to discover, as far as my critics have been able to discover, there isn't a single such tradition that's known to be false. I say then, human beings have a very good record on this. They have a very good record on this. Do lots of people make lots of mistakes? Lots of people make lots of mistakes. But people don't make every possible mistake. Not every possible mistake. There are some mistakes they don't make. This seems, in empirical terms, I'm not consulting my intuition now. I've done a survey of ancient history. I've read books of ancient myths, even more modern myths. There isn't a single known mistake. There are lots of cases of such traditions we know are true. And by the way, these traditions have nothing to do with religion. I said a tradition about an experience. It could be a war. It could be a pestilence. It could be a technological invention that spreads throughout the nation. Migration, there isn't a single such story that's known to be false. So I say we have tremendous empirical evidence. Empirical means evidence through experience. We have tremendous empirical evidence that traditions like this are true. And therefore, we have very good reason to say that this tradition is true. Yeah.
How do you reconcile the hundreds of Bible scholars and academics and conservative rabbis who sort of are in consensus that it didn't actually happen? Like, surely, I'm sure you've read like many of the same primary texts that they have read that led them to radically different conclusions than the one you have. How do you think they arrived at those?
Oh, I know how they arrived at them. The question is whether it's valid or not. I'm not interested in doing the psychology now. I'm interested in reasons, not psychology. That's sort of ad hominem, and I prefer to avoid that. I don't tolerate it when people do it to me, and I try not to engage in that. I don't want to do that. Well, I have a whole presentation of this, both in audio and I've written a couple of things on it. If you're interested in this subject, I can recommend to you, I'll say something about it, but I can recommend to you a couple of books to read. About 18 months ago, 2 books came out with the same title. Very interesting. Written in total ignorance of one another. Within a couple of months, these 2 books came out with the same title. There's a fellow named Richard Elliott Friedman, who's the dean of the biblical critics. He's considered to be the best of the lot. And he wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible? And these people's books were called Who Really Wrote the Bible? There were replies to him, and they took his logic and they examined it piece by piece. And one was written by 2 Jews from Los Angeles. The other was written by a non-Jew. I have written this on my blog, and I've written this people who consult with me, and I say, I challenge you. Read those 2 books and tell me that afterwards you still think it's convincing. You still think biblical criticism or the documentary hypothesis is convincing. I have issued the same challenge to each of you. If this is an interesting subject, they're not very long books, they're not difficult books, but they have a mass of contradictory evidence to that position. I will tell you briefly what's going on. They find elements in the way that the text is written from which they claim there must be different authors. They find differences in style, variations in literary style, like how numbers are written, or what kind of verbs are used, or word order, or sentence structure. And they say, variation in style indicates a different author. And different names of God, which is perhaps the epitome of it. That's where it started with Wellhausen and Company in the 1880s. Different names of God imply different conceptions, and different conceptions are possessed by different communities, which means there are different authors. And there are contradictions and redundancies. A single author wouldn't contradict himself. A single author wouldn't write the same thing twice, unless he's being paid by the word. And that probably was not the case 3,000 years ago. So obviously, if there are contradictions, it must be that one half was written by one author and the other half was written by another author. And redundancies means that there were various documents around, and they were amalgamated, and so where there were overlaps, the overlaps were preserved by the editor. And there are descriptions in the document of laws or ideas that are relevant only when certain political developments take place, like the laws of kings, which would be relevant only when you have a king, or like laws giving preference to Kohanim, which would be relevant when there's a societal conflict between the Kohanim and the rest, and struggle for power. And those texts were obviously written at the time when those political developments took place, which indicates there must be multiple authors. That's roughly the kinds of evidence that they present. There's a lot to be said here. I'm just going to give you one piece of logic. One piece of pure logic, because I'm a logician, that's why I like it. But there's lots of other stuff to say. A person has an idea, and he's looking for evidence. There's a rule that every scientist is aware of, and every philosopher of science uses, makes reference to, and that is this. If I have a thought, Q, and I'm presenting evidence for Q, my first responsibility is to identify Q's competitors. I'm presenting evidence for Q to single it out, to show its value, to show its validity, as opposed to what competitors? What other hypotheses are in the field that the evidence is supposed to single out Q and show it to be superior to the others. That's crucial before you can evaluate the evidence for Q. Evidence is not presented for Q in a vacuum. Okay, so now, these people believe there were many human authors of the text, and they're presenting evidence in favor of that view. What are the competing hypotheses? Well, there are at least two. One is that there was a single human author. The other is that it was God. So you have three theses in the field. Many human authors, one human author, and God. Let's check the evidence that they are presenting for many human authors. Does it count against the other two? I claim it only counts against one, not the other. It only counts against a single human author. It doesn't count against, it's not relevant to the hypothesis that God wrote the text. Why? Because every one of the pieces of evidence relies on human psychology. Would a person, an author, write in many styles? This is false. What I'm telling you now is false in fact. But I'm just going through the logic now. There was a computer study that was done that showed this is false in fact. But I'm just talking about the logic. Would one writer use different styles? Surely not. Again, that's false, but that's how they argue. Surely not. So the different writers, different styles must be different writers. You're talking about human writers. Your experience with human writers leads you to expect that a human writer would use a single style. You see different styles, and you say, well, one human being wouldn't write like that, so it'll be several human beings. Now ask, is that evidence against God's authorship? How do you know how God would write? How many styles would God use? Have you had access to God's private diaries and gone through them to check and see how many styles he uses? Multiple styles has nothing to do with the hypothesis that God wrote it. It's only multiple human versus single human. Names of God. Even if it were true, and it isn't true, in ancient Mesopotamia they had one text where one God has 60 names. So you have 3 or 4 or 5 in our text, and that means there have to be different authors. It's just baloney. But even if you say human individuals and human groups have single names for God, what would that have to do with God's authorship? How do I know how many names God would use for himself in a text that he authored? Contradictions. People don't generally contradict themselves, at least purposely, at least not when it's open and obvious. Okay, but how do you know what God would do if he wrote a book? Whether God would put in contradictions or redundancies. How do you know that he wouldn't put them in? What information do you have about how God would write a book? Texts that have to do with political developments. Sure, if the author is human, he can't know the future. So the text that deals with the laws of the king presumably come from a time when a king was arising. That's true if you assume the authorship is human. But God knows the future. So God can write 1,000 years before. When there will be a king, these will be the laws of the king. All of the evidence that they present has nothing to do with divine authorship. It has only to do with the competition between many human and single human. Therefore, it's not relevant to us at all. The whole project is irrelevant. Now, Richard Elliott Friedman, in his book, who wrote the Bible, I wrote, and it's up on my website, a response to him in his areas where he deals with the Torah. I'm not knowledgeable or trained in the prophets and the writings, so I'm not competent to do that. Only in a couple of places where there were specific problems, but I couldn't do it. But the first 75, 80 pages where he deals with problems of the Torah, I went through the text and I had a concrete refutation of him page by page. And I made this point that I just made to you, and someone wrote me a letter and said, you think you're inventing something? You think you're discovering something? Everyone in biblical scholarship knows that. Of course we're not talking about God. Of course our arguments aren't relevant to God. Of course we don't believe in God, so God isn't a starter for us. So we're just talking about many human versus one human. That's fine. But 90% of the students who come out of your course don't know that. You don't put that in red letters at the beginning. If you're religious, nothing we have to say is relevant for you. No, they go in with a yarmulke, come out without a yarmulke. I went to Brandeis University. I saw with my own eyes how this happened. Once you realize that, you realize that from our point of view, it's a local ball game in the other guy's court. Is it one human or many human? Play your game over there, and you have nothing to do with me. I think the evidence that they present against single human authorship is poor also. I think it's poor. I think it's poorly done. I think it can be responded to. had nothing to do with the with the hypothesis of God. So that's one extremely important point, as again, because it's a point of logic, and I'm a logician, so I like that point. And one other thing which Friedman recognizes, it's in that book or another book where he has like a 25-page summary of all the evidence for documentary hypothesis, and is considered to be the finest, most comprehensive summary of evidence ever put together. Now, when I was becoming religious in the 1960s, this was an issue then, and I went through the sources at that time, and I did it, and I just forgot about it. About 5 years ago, I got a few emails, one right after the other, so I picked it up again, and I went through it again. You have different areas of evidence. The hope and promise in the 1960s was, when we coordinate this evidence and use it to divide the text up into its sub-authors, the categories of evidence will all agree. So, let's say you have two names of God, J and E, which are the main names. So you say, oh, this text belongs to the J, this text belongs to the E. When there are contradictions, you won't find a contradiction within J. You'll find one half in J, one half in E, or D or D. And when you find redundancies, you won't find a redundancy within J or within E. No. The redundancies will be spread out among the authors, which are divided by the names and the styles. All the different categories of evidence will reinforce one another. That was the promise. If that had happened, it would have been, I would say, in scientific terms, it would have had a certain solidity, a certain coherence, a certain integration. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen. J is one name. There are some passages where the name is E, which they have to assign to the J author. Why? Because the subject is a J author subject. So you have to say that over here, the J author used the name E. So the split up in names and split up in subjects doesn't match. So you have to use one criterion and override another criterion. They aren't consistent. They aren't mutually reinforcing. Now, Friedman, to his credit, and I don't often give him credit, Friedman, to his credit, recognizes this, and he says, but all the researchers agree in which way the criteria should be gerrymandered. They all agree when one criterion should take precedence over another criterion. Well, first of all, if that were true, it could be just prejudice, but it isn't true. There's a website in which they go through myriads of disagreements as to how the text should be divided up. It simply isn't true. So that promise of the 60s, 40 years later, 45 years later, was not fulfilled. And indeed, what you have is conflicts between the criteria, and each one has to make his own decision how this text should be divided. I find it hard to treat this as a serious proposal. And that's a synopsis of some of my reasons. But as I say, the rest of it is on tape, and something's written on my website. And if you read those two books, I think you'll find it hard. To take it seriously. The non-Jew, a fellow named Ford, did a very clever thing. In one chapter, he took Friedman's criteria for discovering different authors in a text, and he applied those criteria to Friedman's own text. And he said, according to those criteria, Friedman's text was written by 4 people. That was a very clever thing to do. Various names of the crucial people, principles are given different names in different sections of the book, headings and footnotes don't agree in their vocabulary, and style must be the 4 people who wrote Friedman's book. It was a beautiful parody. At any rate, I find it hard to take it seriously in scholarly terms, and if you look at my replies to Friedman, some of the things that he writes are just astonishing. At any rate, that's what I have to say about that subject.
I've heard evidence from others that there were texts that were used to compose the Torah that were from earlier nations and everything like that. What do you have to say about that evidence?
We have to distinguish two possibilities here, because there are two possible views that you're talking about. You could be talking about what we just talked about, that there were fragments in different communities, and there was an editor, unnamed, but perhaps the most popular figure is Ezra, who put them all together into what we call the 5 books of Moses. Right? Now, there are two things to say about that. I think this is also Ford's point. These people, many of them pledge allegiance to archaeology. And they say, we can't believe the Bible's description of an event unless there's archaeological evidence of it. Otherwise, it's just fantasy, it's just myth, it's just made up. Right? Okay, you're very strict, hard-nosed, strict-minded, cautious. You want archaeological evidence before you accept something. Okay, now you say that our 5 books of Moses were made up of fragments. Do you have any archaeological evidence for those fragments? Any at all? No, there's zero. So why do you believe in them if there's no archaeological evidence? If you think archaeological evidence is the absolute precondition of believing about anything in the ancient world. That's a matter of inconsistency. But take the idea that there were different groups of Jews, proto-Jews, call them whatever you like, with different fragments, different names of God, somewhat different conceptions of God, somewhat differing understandings of history. And then along comes Ezra and puts it all together. He puts it all together into one book. Would you expect that to be a notable event in Jewish religious history? Something which would have an effect? Different groups now become amalgamated into a single people. Each one of them is now receiving a much larger text than they had before and is incorporating it into their belief system. Instead of having one name of God, they now all possess the same 5 names of God. Is that a notable event in Jewish religious history? I would think so. There's not a shred of historical evidence. Not a whisper, not a murmur, not a hint. Nothing. That's astounding. That's astounding. That such an event should take place and there's no hurt. What about debates? What about holdouts? Groups that say, no, we don't believe you, we disagree with you, and we're not following. And they hold out with their fragment. What about celebration? Finally, the text from God has been achieved. This must be a great gift that God gave to the Jewish people, that he finally engineered that the text should come together. There isn't a hint in any Jewish source. We know who invented the law of washing your hands before you eat. Oh, yes, we know. And if you'll say it's a myth, I don't mind. But it means we took care to make a myth for that thing. But the achievement of the one text, completely silent in history. I suggest to you that's just not credible. It's just not credible. So, I mean, if that's what you're talking about, then it's just historically, it's just a fantasy.
And I do know, I believe I do, and maybe I'm wrong about this. One piece where when Ezra displayed the 5 books of Moses, that the people didn't know anything.
Absolutely incorrect. That's absolutely incorrect, and I have that on my website. You have to go through what the text says there very carefully. There's no evidence whatsoever that they didn't know what was being read. There's no evidence. It's just made up. It's just made up. You look carefully at the verses, you'll see in plain Hebrew. I mean, of course, you have to do it in Hebrew, but I did that, and I put it on my website. It's simply not correct. Yeah.
Okay, you were talking yesterday about how Noah and his family disobeyed God directly. Now we see 10 generations from Adam to Noah, God destroyed the world, and then 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, God destroyed 5 cities. And I believe we say that the further back we go, the better the people were. Or maybe that's up till, that's from here to the giving of the Torah. But we see that they sinned also. So what kind of...
There isn't such a rule. There isn't such a rule. The further back you go, the better the people were. The high level of the people, there is no such rule. No one says that, and no one believes that. Indeed, there's a famous statement in the Talmud that in the time of Chizkiyahu, at the end of the First Temple, he set up an educational system, and the public knowledge of Torah was superior to many preceding generations. So it's simply not true that the people is always deteriorating. That's simply not true. There is a doctrine of the leaders, the very top scholars, that there is a certain deterioration. The Maharal describes it in some detail, and it's subtle what the deterioration is, but there's no such idea that the people as a whole always gets worse. It's simply not correct.
So it's more of the fact that the Torah knowledge might lessen from the elite, maybe little by little because we're away from the revelation.
That's right. That's right. Although there is a competing idea, at least for some things, that the closer we get to the coming of the Mashiach, we get some kind of prior energy from the future event, which affects our situation now. And in some respects, there might be some inspiration that was lacking in the interim, in the middle period. But Torah knowledge, Torah grasp, Torah understanding. If you look at the last 800 years, you can see it. If you read the writings of Maimonides or Nachmanides or the Rashba, I mean, the encyclopedic knowledge that they had, the grasp, the depth, the originality that they had, it's just astonishing. It's astonishing. Maimonides wrote a code encapsulating all of Jewish law, making practical decisions wherever there were disagreements, including all of Jewish law which wasn't practiced. All the laws of the sacrifices, all the laws of the king, laws of the Sanhedrin, laws of ritual purity, all of which weren't practiced. He mastered the entire corpus of law and created a brand new organization of it, analyzed it, and rendered practical decisions. I mean, somebody who studies the Torah today and studies those sources, it's just mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. And that's why it's rare for someone in a considerably later period to challenge someone in an earlier period, though in terms of legal rules, there's no limit on whom you can challenge. The only limit is a decision made by the Talmud is unchallengeable, but any other compilation before or afterwards is subject to challenge. The Mishnah was challenged by the scholars of the Talmud and rejected on a number of cases where they decided the law against the Mishnah. And post-Mishnah, whether it's Maimonides' code or the code of Jewish law, is not binding. Later scholars disagree with it and reject its opinions. It's just that when you read the writings of someone and you see the immensely superb grasp that he had, you're reluctant to challenge, even though decisions have to be made on the basis of your own understanding. So if you think you understand differently, you are free to challenge and to reject, and that has happened in every period of Jewish history.
Do you think it's ever possible to know with enough certainty or any certainty why God actually does something? For instance, specifically the Holocaust. If some rabbi professed to know Jews did such and such, or the world did such and such, and thus God, caused the Holocaust to happen. Do you think it's possible to know such a thing?
Well, really you're asking two questions. Is it possible to know? Is it possible to know with certainty? And given what I said before about proof, those are going to be two different questions. Now, there are two ways that a person could know. One is, or maybe three, one is that he has sources in the tradition which go back to revelation and prophecy, which apply in a reasonably clear way to what's going on. And then he could say, look, these sources tell us that when these and these circumstances take place, this is what the reason is, and this is what God wants from us. You can do that. It's akin to applying Jewish law to multinational corporations, or to VCRs, or to thermostats, or to modern technology generally. When those laws were written, these items didn't exist, but they were written on the basis of principles. Those principles can be applied to the new reality as well. That's one possibility. There is, although we don't have prophecy, there is still divine inspiration. There are people whom God favors with knowledge and understanding beyond the normal. That's another way to know. The Chafetz Chaim, one of the greatest scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries, who died in 1933, said several times before he died to several different people, the First World War was child's play. Child's play. About 13 million people died in the First World War. About 65 million people died in the Second World War. He obviously knew something. He was right within a decade. He knew something, but how did he know? So either you say someone who masters the whole of the Torah can know things about the world, or you say he had divine inspiration, and that's a way in which someone can know. When you come to something like the Holocaust, I'm not aware of anyone who claimed divine inspiration. The best a person could do is rely on the sources. I'm not aware of anyone who claimed he has clear, unequivocal sources which definitely apply. There are people who have tried to apply various sources to the Holocaust, and they made various suggestions. I don't think there's anything close to certainty, though there are possibilities which, within the principles that we recognize, would be relevant.
So I read on the internet that Shach, the rabbi, Shach, whatever his name was, said that he had like extremely strong words for people who didn't believe, for Jews who didn't believe that the Holocaust was punishment for centuries of Jews deviating from the Torah. So I don't know if he had proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but what he did say was, if you don't see it the way I see it, then it's tantamount to like not believing, to not being Jewish, to not believing in God. He said something to that extent. I don't have the direct quote.
Okay, but that's a very, very general statement. It's a very general statement. We do believe in divine providence. We don't believe the world is out of control, number one. And we do believe that God takes account of our actions and holds us responsible for our actions. When we talk about the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, and we speak about it in our prayers, we say, Mipnei chatoenu, because of our sins, these things happened. But that leaves a gigantic range of possibilities. When you have people who are very holy and very righteous, then what looks to us like a minuscule infraction, they can be held responsible for, and they can have bitter consequences for it. And when we look at them, we would think they were next to perfect. So that's one possibility of responsibility due to failure, or it's gross responsibility due to failure. There is a case where when a general community fails, even the righteous people in the community are affected by the general destruction. Jeremiah lived through the destruction of the first temple. He didn't deserve it. He was a great tzaddik. He was a great, righteous, holy person. But when the community as a whole fails, even righteous people, so then you can't pin it on each individual. There's a lot of different details, and then to pin down exactly what are the transgressions that they're being held accountable for. There are things which one group will say is a transgression. Other people will say isn't a transgression at all, so it must have been something else. There's a great debate about Zionism, for example, and the people are going to say that Zionism played a great role in bringing about the Holocaust, and other people are going to say that it's neutral, and other people will say, on the contrary, Zionism was something good, and the failures were other kinds of failures. So when you say that responsibility due to failure is what's behind the Holocaust, to use a vague enough term, right? That leaves open a tremendous number of detailed possibilities. That's more what I was thinking of in terms of knowing what the cause is.
So given that there's all those...
Let me say one more word. In other words, what's the alternative? The alternative is that God just causes innocent people to suffer, or God turns his back, doesn't care whether they suffer. That's not going to be a viable alternative in our view.
No. I'm sure there's plenty of possibilities, but for you to say that you know what those possibilities are, like I'm not trying to say there is or there isn't a good reason, or that the innocent children were deserving to suffer for their parents' transgressions. Ignoring that, just to say that you know so well, so profoundly, that you're going to tell other Jews who are alive today after the Holocaust that not believing that your interpretation of what had happened is cause for like being ostracized from the community, something to the effect of you're not as Jewish as you should be, you're not actually Jewish.
Well, look, when you say your interpretation, those words are...
His interpretation.
Well, I understand. I wasn't questioning the pronoun. I was questioning the phrase. Now, when you say someone's interpretation, you can talk about interpretation when you have an ambiguous word or an ambiguous phraseology or syntax, or we have contradictory passages and it's hard to reconcile them and know exactly where this one applies and that one applies. But when you have a consistent theme with no competitors, it's not a question of my interpretation. Let's say, if someone questions whether God is creator of the world, you say, well, you have your interpretation. How do you know that there aren't other alternatives? How do you know what Judaism's final teaching is? Maybe they're teaching you haven't thought of. No, creator is rock bottom line, right? If you question whether God's created the universe, you're just not in the club. Creator of the universe is an absolute starting point. Justice of what God does for the world is an absolute starting point. So someone's going to say, no, it wasn't because they sinned, then he's got to say there's another power that did it, because God only is just, or God isn't always just. God sometimes is unconcerned or random and so forth and so on. Those are non-starters as far as we're concerned. This is not an interpretation. When the word interpretation is used, you're usually talking about a case where things aren't 100% clear, and you have to weigh competing alternatives, and you come out with favoring this over that. God's justice is not one of those cases. Now, when you talk about children, for example, the standard explanation is reincarnation. And then you have God's justice applied even to the children. But to say that it's not God's justice, is to say that they weren't accountable for it, that they were perfectly good people or good enough not to deserve that, and then the alternatives are it was out of control, or a guy went on holiday, or God doesn't care, or it's over the zone. Those are non-starters as far as the Jewish tradition is concerned. That's why every tragedy that has happened to us, we have assigned to our failures throughout Jewish history. So I don't think this is really fit to be called a matter of interpretation. This is, Abraham was the first patriarch. No, maybe it was Isaac. You're interpreting it to Abraham, but who says you can't interpret it to Isaac? Maybe there are other possibilities you haven't thought of. Some things aren't interpretation. They're just bedrock.
So, just something that you said and everything. What evidence do you have of reincarnation?
The evidence that I have is in the Torah that God gave us. It's implicit to the extent that I think I have 90% confidence in passages in the Torah itself and in passages in the prophets' writings. I have an entry on this on my website where I went through the passages. Yehuda takes a woman named Tamar for his oldest son, Er. He dies. So he says, carrying out the custom that was even true at that time, the brother should marry her, and he does. Onan. And he dies. Finally, she tricks Judah into having relations with her, like disguising herself. Gets pregnant. She gives birth to twins. Why do you think she gives birth to twins? Because there are two missing husbands, that's why. And they both have to be replaced. Zerach and Peretz replace Er and Onan. And as the Ramban points out, in every genealogy of the Jewish people, thereafter, Er and Onan are mentioned. They didn't have any children. Why are they in the genealogy? They're always mentioned, and they died, and they had no children, and then she had... Why mention them in the genealogy? Because they didn't get wiped out. They got repeated. Yibum is a question of giving a new vehicle for that soul, so that soul comes back. That's what Ramban says in great detail. He says that on the basis of Rus, where the same language of Yibum is repeated in the case of Rus, and has the same outcome there as well. It's a question of replacing it. That's a very clear example of this idea. Let's give you one more source, and then I have to go teach them upstairs. There was a man named Tzlafchad, and he died. He only had daughters, 5 daughters. Land was going to be a portion of the land of Israel, and a portion to each family. It should have been given to Tzlafchad and his brothers. But Tzlafchad's dead. He only has his daughters. So the daughters come to Moses and to the assembly, and they present an argument. And the Talmud says they were wise, and they were scholarly, and they were clever, and they had tremendous praise for them. And they say, look, don't let our father's name be wiped out. Give us his land. So the reader says, just a moment, ladies. You're worried about his name? His name? When you have children, call them Tzlafchad. Perpetuate his name. Wonderful idea. What's it got to do with land? The word name in Hebrew, sometimes in the Bible, Shem, indicates a person's identity. And their argument, says the Talmud, was this. Either we as daughters stand in place of our father, we carry his identity, in which case we get the land, just as a son would. And if you say that daughters can't stand in place of their father, then give our mother the opportunity to marry one of the brothers to produce a son who will stand in place of the father. But you can't have it both ways. You can't say daughters don't stand in the place and the mother can't marry to produce a son who will stand in the place. That you can't have. And the decision, by the way, is that daughters do stand in the place of their father, and the daughters do get the inheritance. That means that the father's soul is carried by his children. And if it isn't, because he hasn't got any children, so then Yibum takes place to provide another child who will carry his soul. The idea of the soul coming back in another opportunity, in another body, is something which is quite clear. Is it a proof? I told you I don't believe in proofs, but it's quite clear. If you put together all the pieces, it's quite clear that is there. The Zohar talks about it at very great length, and the Zohar goes back to Rishon Bar Yochai.
What about modern, like, are there like modern day examples or anything? I mean, I've heard of stories and things like that, but
I have no idea. The Rizal could identify a person's past, and that was 500 years ago. Since then, I don't know anything. I'm just ignorant. I don't know.